The history of human civilization divides into before and after the externalization of thought. Across the first 5 reports of this archive, we mapped the physical infrastructure of power, the extreme ultraviolet light of ASML, the precision silicon of TSMC, the computational architecture of NVIDIA, the ultra-bandwidth memory of SK Hynix, and the instruction set that governs matter itself through ARM. But those components, on their own, are inert architecture. They are a body waiting for us. Today, we enter node 006, a binary axis connecting the laboratories of San Francisco, OpenAI, with the data centers of Redmond, Microsoft. What the world is witnessing is not a simple corporate alliance. It is the construction of the most ambitious cognitive infrastructure ever attempted, a system designed not merely to process information, but to synthesize reasoning, centralize intelligence, and for the first time, contest the intellectual primacy of the human species. In this node, capital has ceased to be a flow of money. It has become a flow of energy and probability. Welcome to the declassification of the most consequential node of our era.
Chapter 1: The Golden Cage.
For the mind of OpenAI to exist, it needed a body that defied the laws of traditional economics. That body was Microsoft Azure. Between 2019 and 2023, Microsoft committed $13 billion to OpenAI. But this was not a conventional investment. A significant portion of that capital was structured as compute credits. Microsoft was selling its own processing capacity back to OpenAI, ensuring that every dollar invested returned to its own data centers as operating margin. It was a financial Ouroboros, the investor feeding itself through the very infrastructure it provided. 4 years. This created what we call the golden cage. OpenAI did not own its servers. It lived, breathed, and processed entirely within Microsoft's supercomputing clusters. Microsoft provided the GPUs from node 003, the high bandwidth memory from node 004, the networking fabric, the cooling systems, and the physical security. In exchange, OpenAI delivered the brain of Microsoft's global productivity suite, Copilot. This symbiosis allowed Microsoft to position Azure as the only cloud capable of hosting frontier artificial intelligence. But every cage, no matter how golden, breeds the desire to escape. And in this cage, two men began to see different futures. At the height of their partnership, Satya Nadella would text Sam Altman multiple times a day. When internal negotiations stalled, Altman would post screenshots of his conversations with Nadella directly to OpenAI's company Slack to expedite matters. But the relationship began fracturing through Altman's brief ouster from OpenAI in November 2023. Nadella responded by acquiring an insurance policy, hiring Mustafa Suleyman, co-founder of DeepMind and former CEO of Inflection AI, to build competing AI models inside Microsoft. Altman responded by seeking infrastructure beyond Azure. They went from texting 5 times a day to speaking once a week. Nadella described the relationship publicly as frenemies. The philosophical rift cut even deeper. Altman insisted that OpenAI had essentially built artificial general intelligence, or was very close. Nadella publicly disagreed. "I don't think we are anywhere close to AGI." This was not merely an intellectual debate. It was a strategic fracture. If AGI was imminent, OpenAI's value was incalculable, and it needed freedom. If it was not, Microsoft's infrastructure leverage remained supreme. In January 2025, the cage formally cracked. Microsoft's exclusive hold over OpenAI's infrastructure was broken. By October 2025, Microsoft lost its right of first refusal on new workloads. And by early 2026, the intellectual property license between the two entities became non-exclusive. The cage did not simply open. It was dismantled from the inside by an architect who wanted to become his own landlord. Yet the escape is not a divorce. OpenAI committed to purchasing $250 billion in Azure services. Microsoft retains a 27% equity stake valued at approximately $135 billion. The relationship has mutated from captivity into a calculated, transactional coexistence between two entities that need each other, but no longer trust each other with the keys.
Chapter 2: Project Stargate and the Thermodynamics of Intelligence.
The instrument of OpenAI's liberation has a name: Stargate. Project Stargate is not a Microsoft project. It is an independent joint venture, Stargate LLC, incorporated in Delaware, whose equity funders are SoftBank, OpenAI, Oracle, and MGX, the sovereign technology fund of the United Arab Emirates. SoftBank holds the financial responsibility. Masayoshi Son chairs the board. OpenAI holds the operational responsibility. Microsoft, alongside NVIDIA, ARM, and Oracle, participates as a technology partner, not as the financier. The numbers are staggering. The initial deployment alone is $100 billion, 10 times the total cost of the James Webb Space Telescope. But Stargate's full ambition extends to $500 billion over 4 years. The flagship site in Abilene, Texas, will consume 1.2 gigawatts when fully operational across all planned sites. The target capacity is 10 gigawatts, roughly the output of 10 nuclear power plants running at full capacity. This is no longer computer science. This is energy infrastructure at the scale of nation-states. And this is precisely why the project is exploring small modular reactors. Sam Altman, who personally backs the nuclear startup Oklo, understands that the future of computation is not written in code. It is written in kilowatt hours. Now, here is where the physical infrastructure of this entire archive converges. Every single GPU inside Stargate carries the fingerprint of every node we have documented. The silicon is fabricated by TSMC, Node 002, using ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography from Node 001 on advanced process nodes that require CoWoS advanced packaging to stack logic and memory. The high bandwidth memory layered on top of each accelerator is SK Hynix's HBM3E from Node 004. The instruction set governing the CPU cores is ARM-S architecture from Node 005. The most recent deployments feature tens of thousands of NVIDIA Blackwell Ultra GPUs, the GB300 NVL72, interconnected via quantum, X800 InfiniBand at 800 gigabits per second per GPU. Simultaneously, Microsoft's custom Mayer 100 accelerators, 105 billion transistors fabricated on TSMC's 5nm node, use a proprietary high-speed Ethernet interconnect capable of 4,800 gigabits per second of all gather bandwidth. At this density of compute, air cooling is physically impossible. These clusters operate under direct liquid cooling, chilled fluid flowing through cold plates mounted directly on the silicon. The thermodynamics of intelligence is not a metaphor. It is a literal engineering constraint. If you cannot remove the heat fast enough, the mind stops thinking. Stargate is not a new chapter of this archive. It is the convergence point of every choke point we have documented. Whoever controls this cathedral of compute holds the keys to the first frontier superintelligence. But whoever is no longer a single entity. It is a consortium of capital, Japanese, Emirati, American, racing to build the physical substrate of the next era of cognition.
Chapter 3: The Blood of the Algorithm.
Why is capital converging on this node with such ferocity? The answer lies in the scaling laws. In 2020, researchers at OpenAI published a landmark paper demonstrating that the performance of language models follows a power law. The loss of a model, its error, its distance from perfect reasoning, decreases predictably as you increase compute, data, and parameters. The simplified relationship can be expressed as L of C equals A times C to the power of negative B, where C is compute and A and B are empirical constants. In 2022, DeepMind's Chinchilla paper revised the exponents significantly, proving that earlier models had been undertrained relative to their size, meaning the ratio of data to parameters matters as much as raw scale. The laws were refined, but the core observation held: more compute, applied correctly, produces more capable reasoning. But these are empirical observations, not mathematical certainties. They are patterns extracted from historical data, not guarantees of infinite returns. And the market is beginning to notice the cracks. In early 2026, reporting from the information revealed that OpenAI had missed its own internal projections for user growth and revenue. Its finance chief warned colleagues that if revenue growth does not accelerate, the company could face difficulty funding its future compute agreements. The financial paradox of this node is brutal. In March 2025, OpenAI raised $40 billion at a valuation of $300 billion, the largest private funding round in history, led by SoftBank. By August, it raised another $8.3 billion at the same valuation. By October, the company completed its restructuring into a public benefit corporation, shedding the last vestiges of its original non-profit charter at a valuation of $500 billion. But behind these astronomical valuations lies a machine that hemorrhages cash. In 2024, OpenAI generated approximately $3.7 billion in revenue, while burning significantly more than it earned, a pattern that only intensified in 2025. In the first half of 2025, revenue reached $4.3 billion, but the company burned $2.5 billion in cash and spent $6.7 billion on research and development. OpenAI does not expect to become cash flow positive until it reaches $125 billion in annual revenue, a milestone it projects for 2029. The algorithm of God is being built on financial faith, the belief that scaling laws will eventually convert compute into profit. The mission has not changed in words, but the incentive architecture has changed in substance. And the data itself is becoming a weapon. OpenAI and Microsoft are executing what can only be described as the enclosure of the digital commons, through licensing agreements with Axel Springer, granting access to Politico, Business Insider, Build and Welt, and with Reddit, estimated at $70 million annually. They are purchasing the rights to the written history of human thought. In financial terms, this creates a formidable barrier to entry, but formidable is not absolute. Google possesses its own civilizational scale archive through search, YouTube, and Gmail. Meta controls the social graph of 3 billion humans. The moat is real, but it is contested. What is undeniable? That intelligence has become a form of intellectual rent, measured not in quarterly profits, but in the volume of human knowledge converted into proprietary training signal.
Chapter 4: Cognitive Sovereignty and the Fractured Map.
We arrive at the core mission of this archive: power. Node 006 is not merely a company or a partnership. It is a proto-state of data. Cognitive sovereignty is the capacity of a nation to think for itself without depending on external models. When a government integrates a frontier model into its public administration, its legal drafting, or its defense apparatus, it is allowing the value system, the biases, and the alignment protocols of a small group in San Francisco and Redmond to filter its decision-making. Every model carries the fingerprint of its creators, their language, their ethics, their choices about what is safe and what is dangerous. The technical mechanism is called reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF. It is the process by which a small team of human annotators encodes their judgment of right and wrong directly into the neural weights of the model. This is not conspiracy. It is architecture. And it means that every government using GPT is, in part, governed by the moral compass of its trainers. Microsoft has recognized this tension and is capitalizing on it through its Sovereign Cloud initiative, launched in 2025 with 3 tiers: Sovereign Public Cloud, Sovereign Private Cloud, and National Partner Clouds, including Blue in France with Orange and Capgemini, and Delos Cloud in Germany with SAP. The promise is that data will not leave national borders, but the master model, the weights, the reasoning architecture, the alignment layer, still resides in centralized training clusters. Sovereignty over the data is not sovereignty over the mind. And so, the fracture has begun. France, through Mistral AI, is building what aspires to be the largest AI campus in Europe, a joint venture with MGX, BPI France, and NVIDIA near Paris, with a planned capacity of 1.4 gigawatts and 109 billion euros in national AI structure investment. The United Arab Emirates, through the Technology Innovation Institute, developed Falcon. Europe has gone further. The EU AI Act, which entered into force in August 2024, is the world's first comprehensive legal framework for artificial intelligence. Its obligations for general-purpose AI models, including frontier models like GPT, took effect in August 2025, requiring transparency, documentation, and systemic risk assessment. Full enforcement of high-risk artificial intelligence provisions arrives in August 2026. Europe is not just building models, it is building law, attempting to regulate the grammar of cognition itself. But the map of cognitive power is not the duopoly this node might suggest. Google DeepMind runs its frontier models on custom TPU silicon, now in its 6th generation, Trillium, delivering 4.7 times the peak performance of its predecessor and a 67% improvement in energy efficiency. Entirely independent of NVIDIA's ecosystem, Anthropic breathes through Amazon Web Services, which in April 2026 committed up to $33 billion in total investment, securing 5 gigawatts of compute capacity on Amazon's custom Trainium chips. Anthropic's annualized revenue run rate reached $30 billion in April 2026, with over 1,000 enterprise customers spending more than $1 million a year on Claude. And then there is the nightmare scenario for the Stargate thesis. In January 2025, DeepSeek, a Chinese laboratory, operating under severe American export restrictions. Training on H800 GPUs with reduced interconnect bandwidth demonstrated that architectural ingenuity can compensate for raw compute. DeepSeek V3, a 671 billion parameter model that activates only 37 billion parameters per token through mixture of experts architecture, achieved GPT-4 class performance for approximately $5.6 million in compute, roughly 1/50th the cost of comparable Western models. Its successor, DeepSeek R1, matched OpenAI's O1 on advanced reasoning tasks. Within a week of its release, the DeepSeek app surpassed ChatGPT as the most downloaded free app on the American iOS App Store. On January 27th, Nvidia lost $589 billion in market capitalization in a single day, the largest single-day loss in stock market history. This is the question that haunts every investor in this node. Is intelligence purely a function of scale, or is it also a function of elegance? If the answer is elegance, then the $500 billion cathedral may be less of a fortress and more of a monument to a scaling paradigm that history has already begun to question. Here is the cruel arithmetic of sovereignty. You can have the code, you can have the data, you can even have an efficient architecture born under constraint. But if you do not have access to the advanced silicon of node 003, the lithography of node 001, the memory of node 004, and the energy infrastructure to sustain it all, your sovereignty remains tethered to someone else's supply chain. The race for artificial intelligence is not a race of software. It is a race to avoid becoming a cognitive vassal of the nodes we are mapping in this archive.
Chapter 5. The hardware is the law.
OpenAI and Microsoft have not closed the circle. They have cracked it open. What began in this archive with the manipulation of photons in the Netherlands has evolved into the synthesis of intelligence in the United States. But the synthesis is no longer contained within a single cage. It has spilled across a consortium of capital, Japanese, Emirati, American, racing to build the physical substrate of the next era of cognition. And it faces challenges it did not anticipate. A Chinese lab that matched its reasoning for a fraction of the cost. A European regulatory framework that seeks to govern the grammar of thought. A Google that builds its own silicon from the transistor to the model. And an Amazon that is writing $33 billion checks to ensure it is never left without a frontier mind. Node 006 represents a point of inflection. The infrastructure of global capital has mutated from a tool of production into an architecture of autonomous decision. The algorithm of God remains a metaphor, but it is a metaphor that is being engineered into existence, 1 kilowatt-hour and 1 GPU at a time. If the scaling laws continue to hold, the concentration of synthetic intelligence in the hands of a few actors is not science fiction. It is civil engineering in progress, and yet the outcome is not predetermined. The laws could plateau, the consortium could fracture. A more efficient architecture, born under constraint in Hangzhou, or regulated into transparency in Brussels, or grown on custom silicon in Mountain View, could rewrite the rules of scale. The future of intelligence is not a prophecy, it is a contest. But remember our fundamental premise: the software is the language we speak, but the hardware, the silicon, the energy, the cooling, the supply chain, the law, is the architecture under which we are permitted to think. This is the 6th report of a 25-year archive. The infrastructure of capital has no borders. Only nodes of power. This has been a Silicon Node Intelligence briefing. Follow the money. Follow the nodes. If you value this level of industrial intelligence and want to stay ahead of the disruptive trends shaping 21st century and beyond, join us.
We are Silicon Node Reports, and this was OpenAI and Microsoft, the $500 billion architecture of cognitive sovereignty. Subscribe to Silicon Node Reports. Let's decode the future of the world's most critical supply chains together. Silicon Node Reports, the infrastructure of global capital.